and I am in Portland, Oregon. As soon as we, okay, I think we're gonna get the call started here. Hi everyone again. Like I said, I'm Abigail from BWB Portland, or BWB Black Rock City, depending on the time of year. I'm supporting this panel, and if you'd like, I invite you to open up the chat function at the bottom of your screen and introduce yourself and where you're calling from in the chat box. You can see a bunch of people are already on that. We're excited to bring in our hosts and panelists in just one moment, but as everyone enters the room, I'm just going to do a little bit of Zoom housekeeping for a second. I just want to remind everyone that this panel is being recorded and live in the Community Conversation series on BWB YouTube and the Burners Without Borders website. So for anyone who hasn't been able to join us live yet, they'll be able to watch this panel. We'll share it through the BWB communications channel when it's all ready to go. We will have time for questions and answering at the end. If you want to drop your questions into the chat box as you listen, if your question is for a specific panelist, just indicate that. We do have a team member in the chat box who's going to be tracking all the questions. We're going to keep the audience muted and their videos off throughout the call. And then if we get to the question and answering on time, we'll have the opportunity for folks to turn on their videos to ask their questions live. And so with that, I'm going to start with a brief land acknowledgement that was brought up by some of the panelists. We're using the script that they use at the Catharsis on the Mall one. And so we acknowledge that this city and the National Mall on which we hold our annual vigil for healing stands upon occupied, unceded territory, the ancestral homeland of the Nacotchtank, whose descendants belong to the Piscataway peoples. Furthermore, the foundation of the city and most of the original buildings in Washington, D.C. were funded by the sale of enslaved people of African descent and built by their hands. As we acknowledge the past, we honor it as an essential part of our present, our current shared relationship with the land, as well as our responsibility to it, as our relative and our home, as well as our haven to all relatives of this world. And so, thank you. With that, I'd like to take a moment to just introduce our digital event staff supporting the call. Again, I'm Abigail. I'm going to be just general support here. I'm going to be capturing links and resources discussed in the panel. Those will be made available later. And I'm also backup host in case Molly's internet fails. And then up next, we've got Molly Rose.
Hi, everyone. I am super excited. My name is Molly Rose. I'm the program manager for Burners Without Borders, and I'll be hosting our panel today. If Emma wants to go ahead and quickly introduce yourself. You're on mute.
I knew I'd do something like that. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Weissman. I'm going to be monitoring the chat box for questions, so go ahead and put any questions that come up while the panelists are speaking in there. Feel free to direct message me if you need to, and I will pass them along to Molly to ask for you.
Thank you. And if Heather/Tranquility wants to introduce yourself.
Hey guys, what's up? I'm supporting you as a technical moderator today. Welcome and thanks for being here.
Thank you. So we are going to start off with a poll so that our panelists can get an idea of who is in the room with us. So I'm going to launch it, and it's how familiar are you with Burning Man culture? 1 being never heard of it, 5 being it's my life. Scale of 1 to 5. We'll give you all a couple seconds. And as you're filling out that poll, I'll just let you know that Burners Without Borders is a program within the Burning Man Project. We are a leadership program, and part of my role is to support burners in the skills and resources that they need to have the impact that you want to have in the world. BWB also refers to a network of leaders facilitating chapters and impact projects around the world. So we're gonna end the poll, and Tranquility, if you can let me know if this poll is working. I'm gonna end it.
It's working great. We can share the results with participants vocally or show them.
Okay, can we show them the poll?
All right, we're going to share those results with you now.
Great. So I don't know, I'm not able to see the results, but as we're looking at it, I'll tell you that in this conversation, we're mostly talking about BWB as the extended network of burners who are interested in or passionate about civic impact and community building. And we at BWB HQ are hosting this conversation to serve our shared interest in embodying the 10 principles out in the world and in deepening our relationships and shared work with other individuals, organizations, and networks who are aligned with our burner values. Can you, Trinity, just give us a verbal snapshot of those poll results?
Yeah, poll number 1, how familiar are you with Burning Man culture? It looks like 68% of you are completely familiar, 16% are so-so or kind of familiar, and we've got 4% who are kind of never really heard of what this Burning Man culture thing is.
Great, thank you. And Tranquility, are you able to launch our second poll?
I am, here we go.
So our second poll is just going to be, how familiar are you with mutual aid? Same 1 to 5, 1 being this is your first time learning about it in this framework, and 5 being it's my life. And this is also just to give our panelists an idea of who is in the room. So we'll give you a few moments, and as you fill out that poll, I'll just tell you that mutual aid has a few different commonly held meetings. And for the purposes of this conversation, we're defining it as a noun, the cooperative as opposed to the competitive factors operating in the development of society. That's from the Collins Dictionary. So in other words, it's the idea of working hand in hand, neighbor helping neighbor, or in the spirit of shared struggle, right? It's about solidarity, not charity, power with rather than over. And mutual aid rejects that there are passive receivers of aid or powerful givers or heroes. And right now it's filling the cracks left where systems fail people. And that's something that I think resonates with a lot of our BWB networks and the work out in the world. And so can we go ahead and share those poll results, Tranquility?
Certainly, here we go.
Great. And I'm not able to see our poll results. So could you give us just one quick overview of what those results are?
Yes, question was, how familiar are you with mutual aid? Those that are completely familiar with it are about 10% of those of you here in this, attending this. Kind of so-so, not really sure what it is, 40%, and not even heard of what mutual aid is, 18%.
Great, that's awesome. We are so excited to have all of you in the room. So the concept has been around forever, but the phrase mutual aid comes from Kropotkin, who was a Russian activist / philosopher in the early 1900s. And it was a counter to the social Darwinist argument of survival of the fittest as a model for social life. And the mutual aid argument was that human life and flourishing emerges from structures of mutual support. We'll dive into it. Our panelists are 3 incredible burners who are here because of an exciting conversation that they've shared in our BWB Slack space and through our first weeks of our community roundup calls around burners responding to COVID-19. And we'll drop a link to that ongoing event in the chat. But the conversation has been around the ways that mutual aid and burner culture are coming together, or in some cases diverging, as citizens organize in the face of the global pandemic. Our community has seen some resonances and some differences between and within these cultural frameworks, if we want to call it that. Organizers and burners have been thinking about this and moving the needle on this conversation since at least 2005, when Burners Without Borders spontaneously came together around Hurricane Katrina, and probably for much longer. So I'm thankful that now in 2020, we can host a panel like this to bring more folks into the conversation. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce our panelists. We're gonna drop their full bios into the chat, and I'll start with welcoming Ursa Lee. Originally from the Pacific Northwest, they've lived and worked in many different places throughout the United States and abroad. Her focus on food justice has seen her working and organizing with groups including Black Lives Matter, Seattle Black Feminists, and Seattle Lifelong AIDS Alliance, to name a few. Questions about denial of food and the existence of food deserts led her to pursue a master's degree in Washington, D.C., where she still lives and continues to organize around food justice issues. Ursula is a community organizer, storyteller, and activist, and since COVID-19 has jumped headfirst into mutual aid in her community. So happy to see you, Ursula. Next, I'm happy to introduce Joshua Carroll. He's been a core organizer and board member for Catharsis on the Mall in Washington, D.C. since it was founded in 2015 and served as the curator between 2016 and 2018. He's an active member and sometimes project lead for Burners Without Borders DC working group. And Joshua has been thinking about and practicing how burners can best show up in culturally diverse solidarity and organizing spaces for the past 5 years, including work at Standing Rock, Catharsis on the Mall, and local activist and organizing projects in DC, perhaps most notably when he helped organize a massive queer dance street protest outside of Mike Pence's house 2 nights before his inauguration. And last but certainly not least, I'm very excited to introduce Michael. Raised in a Russian household, Michael studied biology and was president of his fraternity at University of Chicago. He describes himself as following the default path, and after succeeding in corporate America for 8 years, working directly with corporate executives, finding Burning Man in 2018 amplified the cracks in the system he'd been seeing. He's since been an active costume culture and was a co-lead for their camp at Loveburn this last year. This past December, he left his corporate job, congratulations, and in March, he co-founded Sunnyside Woodside Mutual Aid in response to COVID-19 and has been focusing his energy on the work full-time ever since. So we're gonna get started, and we wanna share 2 community norms for this call that are grounded in some of the alignments we already see between the Burning Man 10 principles and the principles and values of mutual aid. Even though the four of us on video have already enrolled in these agreements, we're going to review them for everyone because this kind of communication and frame setting can make the difference between a productive conversation and one where people feel unheard or misunderstood. So our first call agreement is that no one knows everything and together we know a lot, which is resonant with our principle of communal effort and the mutual aid value of horizontal collaboration. And our last one is to expect and respect a lack of closure. We only have a very short amount of time to dig into a very meaty topic, and we're not going to be able to get to everything, but we hope that this can be a jumping off point. So with that, hello panelists. How's everybody doing?
Good.
So we're going to start with just some framing of what is mutual aid. And I'd love to start with Ursula. So for someone who's totally unfamiliar, what does engaging in mutual aid look like for you?
Am I off mute? I am off mute. Apologies if there's sirens and stuff. There's something going on outside. But yeah, so for me, mutual aid it's something very organic and just kind of on the ground. It's not charity. It's basically looking at folks that are in your community, your neighbors, your family, whoever, and having a respect towards working together to solve an issue. For me, mutual aid is so special because it has a lot of elements of Burning Man culture, but beyond that, it's so sacred in terms of like community building and working together to solve an issue. And in particular, I'm in love with the idea of, there's not necessarily hierarchies in mutual aid. It just kind of naturally fits together. Of course, you start to see some of those things come out as time goes on, but generally, mutual aid is neighbors caring for neighbors in a way it's not charity. So it's like, I'm not going to go out and basically bring charity because you have less than me at that moment. It's like a really deep-seated appreciation for the other person as a person. And even beyond that, mutual aid can extend to, our planet as well. So folks that are protesting in activist spaces for, the earth that we live on, and also for animals. It's just kind of like understanding that we are all connected. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So thank you. In your answer, you mentioned centering those most vulnerable. And I just want to go back to that because I think that's about social justice. So I guess first, maybe you could just tell us what social justice means for someone who's not familiar.
Yeah, so that is such a big term, and that could be a whole dissertation, which it obviously already probably has been a dissertation. But social justice is basically, I don't have the official, if someone wants to drop the official definition in there, that would be great. But relating back to mutual aid and centering voices, oftentimes, like you were stating earlier in your introduction, a lot of services often are very linear, it's bureaucratic, it's kind of hard to understand what services you might need in that moment, especially when it comes to like emergency situations like, Katrina or COVID, for example. It definitely, a lot of the resources that are out there might be dehumanizing, or they might just not have the resources themselves to truly be set up to help folks that don't necessarily have the resources. So, and what I mean by centering the voices of those who are marginalized or might not have always had a voice at the table is basically looking for those that are already in the community doing the work. That's a main big part of mutual aid, is already linking up with folks that are doing the work, because often than not, people that are marginalized have already been forgotten by the system. So there's already organizations and community members and other folks that are doing the work. So mutual aid is a big principle of that, is basically to look to community leaders. And thank you, somebody dropped the chat, or I need to get this off because it's so distracting. Sorry. But so yeah, I think that's kind of, I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's kind of like what I think of in terms of like centering voices, is basically, it's not necessarily about you and your thought. It's almost like when you go to another country and folks are taking pictures of like, brown children or whatever, like, and they're posting on their Instagram. That is not a component of mutual aid. Mutual aid is something that you do because you're a good person and you want to help your community folk. Like, you really actually do want to help them. And it's not something that you're going to turn around and be like, oh, I'm going to put this on my Instagram, or, trying to get accolades out of it. It's a really raw need to connect with your neighbors and really gifts a skill or gift your time or your resources to helping out folks that might not be in a situation where they can, in return, do that as well.
Thank you. You just said something that made me think of something we're going to touch on a little bit later. And I would love to hear just a little bit more from our framing of mutual aid and just kind of what is it, if we can hear from Joshua about kind of what your experience has been with mutual aid and the overlap with the burner culture.
Sure, absolutely. So I think I was kind of thinking about this connection between mutual aid and Burning Man, and actually a Larry Harvey quote came to mind this morning, which is kind of Larry talking about burner culture and how it evolves. And he says, well, it seems to me that all real communities grow out of a shared confrontation with survival. Communities are not produced by sentiment or mere goodwill. They grow out of a shared struggle. Our situation in the desert is an incubator for community. And to me, that kind of speaks to some of the overlap in the way that burn community tends to operate, and some of the things that we see in mutual aid, where there's things around civic engagement, there's things around participation and helping people that need help, coming up with just like looking for the people around you and kind of keeping an eye on each other, and these kinds of things that tend to happen when we're put in positions of hardship or experiences of struggle. And so I think that, is like a key burner value that, you see a lot at burns and in burner communities, I think, in many places, that I think is also tied in with mutual aid, where mutual aid is similarly these kind of communities that are experiencing shared struggle and hardship, oftentimes due to oppression from capitalism and all these other kinds of forms of oppression that exist in different ways, and saying like, how are we going to meet these needs and like do the work that's necessary here in front of us in order to survive.
One of the mutual aid values that I want to dig into that Ursa Lee mentioned is solidarity, not charity. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what that means and why it's so important.
Yeah, I think it's really one of the really key things about engaging in mutual aid, and really, in my opinion, engaging in any kind of activism or trying to particularly for someone like me that comes from a place of a lot of privilege. I think the models of charity are the things that we're kind of given, and there's a lot of having this idea of like, and I spent years doing this myself. Like even when I first moved to DC, this was kind of the way that I saw it, of being the hero, helping people, coming in and doing good work. And I think that is a great, that comes from a beautiful place, and there's a great instinct there in terms of wanting to do good. But in many cases, that really will center yourself in terms of doing that, and particularly, again, if you're coming if you're coming from a place of a lot of privilege, by centering yourself, it can almost start to replicate the same systems that you're trying to work with in a different way. So solidarity, on the other hand, in my opinion, is about, as Ursula was kind of saying, as you were saying, Molly, like centering the people that are really at the heart of what the experience of whatever the hardship is, and recognizing that it may not be about you. Kind of trying to tie that to like a burner analogy. It kind of reminded me of thinking about how we talk about like no spectators. And in many ways, a charity model is kind of like, oh, it's like I'm a spectator to this thing that's happening that's like outside of me, that's happening to someone else, and I can go and help. But then when I'm done, I can go back to, my other life that's like separate. Whereas I think solidarity is kind of about a place of mind that's more like, yeah, you're going to get really dusty. The dust is going to get on all your stuff. Like you're kind of in it. It's going to change you. And being humble to that, being open to that.
So Emma, our chat box moderator, is about to drop into the chat box just a document that people can look at to think about these things. And it's a comparison between the Burning Man 10 principles and an example of mutual aid core values. Not all mutual aid share the same values, and they might be shared in different ways, but we got this example from mutual aid disaster relief. So this might help folks thinking about these topics. So I'd love to hear from Michael. Michael is kind of the newest on our panel to mutual aid. So what has your mutual aid experience looked like in the past couple of months?
I mean, it's been a whirlwind. I mean, like, yes to Ursa Lee, yes to Joshua, all of that, and trying to absorb. I think I want to make a distinction between like disaster relief and mutual aid. And I think a lot of people, when they face a disaster, they want to go help and throw resources, whether it's time, energy, money, food, at it to relieve the disaster. Mutual aid done well can provide disaster relief. And in my experience, that's a lot of what we're seeing, sourcing food and getting it out to people. But it's really about community. It's about building a new type of relating to each other. And my experience of like when I came upon the concept in my head was, wow, this is culture change that is absolutely necessary. And oh, I wonder how that links in with Burning Man culture that I and so many of us hold so dear.
I remember when we first connected a few months ago, you were sharing some of your experiences about entering the mutual aid spaces as a burner. And I wonder what you've noticed or been curious about as a burner entering those spaces, as a leader, no less, and how that's changed for you over your time doing the work.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's really an opportunity to drive new cultures that are more humane. I think that as a burner, we have this opportunity, this incredible privilege to spend a week or more in these, sandbox environments to live out these principles and these values. And I think we're inclined, or maybe that's just me, tend to be inclined to think, oh, well, we can just do this. Why can't we just do this in the real world? And mutual aid is basically like, hold on, yes, future state, but like these are the realities. And I'm seeing mutual aid as the segue to whatever utopic, Burning Man state that happens in X number of generations from now, which it's not going to happen in our lifetimes. But like, this is the way of living our values and principles that we believe, and helping community embrace those in a way that's grounded in like the reality of existence for so many people.
Thank you for that. And I also want to call out that there are a lot of people dropping their own definitions of mutual aid into the chat box, which is awesome. So please check it out. There are many definitions of this framework, and it's great to see people activated. I'm wondering if Joshua or Ursula, if either of you have a response to what Michael just shared, or kind of challenging, asking those questions. What can we learn from one another in these frameworks?
I mean, I think there's a lot to learn on all ends. I think I'm a fan of history, and history of people. I study anthropology, so that's kind of what I revert back to in terms of like looking at the world. I think Burning Man culture, learning from mutual aid learning from Burning Man, just kind of, and this is kind of going to what Gustavo was saying in the chat. I think it's a really authentic need for collaboration and also learning. I think that the principles of Burning Man, especially some of the key ones, and they're all key, of course, consent being, the 11th, but, like radical inclusion, gifting, I had to write them down. I was like, do not forget them. Communal effort, those tie directly into mutual aid, and so much could be taught. I think what's important, and kind of going to what Michael was saying, as burners that are able to, and I think Joshua mentioned this and Gustavo, burners that are able to go and spend, $2,000 or more to go off to the desert, for a pilgrimage, come from a place of privilege. So definitely taking that step back and really kind of getting to the ground of what the community needs and having the community drive that, especially the folks that are, again, doing the work already, is super important. And then in turn, I think what's really, really important, and especially with, the mutual aid work that I'm doing, is, again, it's decentralized. There's not necessarily leaders, but there are natural folks that are coming out, especially the ones that, are from Washington, D.C., have been organizing here for years on end, and will continue to after this disaster, because like Michael said, it's not just disaster. Mutual aid is something that is a continuous thing that should be happening throughout, even when there isn't a disaster or a pandemic. We should be helping our neighbors irregardless. It should just be happening. But kind of going back to that, I think what's really beautiful is, burners have a unique opportunity to really apply some of the things that they've learned in the desert to what is going on, especially in terms of like flexibility and like planning for the unexpected. That's really important. And in my ward, I know we have weekly calls, and it's beautiful to see that folks are able to basically throw out an idea, and it might not be a good idea, but the fact that, we're giving folks that space to kind of explore and play around with ideas is really cool and kind of unique. I haven't, in other organizing spaces I've been in, that hasn't necessarily been kind of the focus, is that exploration of play and kind of ideas. I've seen it in Catharsis on the Mall, but I think mutual aid is definitely a unique world where a lot of that is encouraged, because again, you're dealing with a lot of, you're dealing with issues that might not have resources. So you do have to be creative, and then you have to be creative in a sustainable longevity, I guess, way, because again, it's not going to go away after we get the virus. We have to still think about the economic downfall that folks are, you know, currently experiencing and will continue to experience. So I think that's kind of the beautiful thing, is burners and mutual aid folks can just kind of have this playful relationship in terms of like exchanging ideas and kind of like allowing folks to kind of explore different ways of thinking.
Yeah, I think just to tag on that briefly, I think that the things that burners can really bring to mutual aid work, to me, some of the core things in engaging with this kind of work, I think like the playfulness that Ursa spoke about, and you know, it not always having to be the most serious thing, like figuring out how to bring joy into it. I think particularly in my experience, when you have people that are coming from, again, kind of more of a place of privilege, that are kind of exploring some of these things and wanting to get involved, there can be an ethic of like, let's plan and like talk and spend a lot of time like kind of figuring stuff out. And the way that I think burners tend to learn to just do things and just be like, let's just go do it, let's go build it, let's, you know, that I think particularly when, again, you're working with people that are coming from relatively more privileged, tend to not think that way. And so bringing that kind of spirit, I think, is really helpful. In my experience, when I work with people that are really like, yeah, like in the community being impacted by this stuff all the time, they are actually also really good at that. And it's really fun to find people like that. And like, for me, at least, I get a lot of joy out of that. And I think also burners have a lot of practical skills a lot of times, and also have infrastructure, have, you know, buses that we can move food around, have, you know, sewing machines that we can make stuff, have kitchen equipment, you know, all these kinds of things. So I think finding ways to plug that stuff in is super valuable. On the flip side, what can burners learn from mutual aid? I think, you know, certainly, you know, digging into and understanding, again, kind of these ideas of social justice, oppression, and kind of just general like political education. For me, that's been a huge one. More in terms of the burner culture itself, I really like Gustavo made a great point in the chat, which I was also thinking about today, that when you're in a mutual aid context, a lot of times the people that you're working with, they don't have a choice about being in that situation or not. And that's the situation that they've spent the majority of their life in that community, you know? Whereas with Burning Man, we tend to, you know, it's like we do a thing for a couple of weeks. We don't necessarily have to, at least in the context of an event, we don't necessarily have to maintain relationships with those people for the rest of our lives, or like be in that situation. So I think a lot of the things around inclusion and learning how to have long-term relationships and sustainability are things that tend to come in that like I've learned a lot from mutual aid, that like when duocracy breaks down, or when, you know, treating people as based on their productivity, you know, breaks down, that I think we can learn a lot by engaging in mutual aid communities. And I think some of the questions that, you know, the Burning Man culture has been wrestling with for a long time, there's a lot to learn there.
Yeah, and then just to even add on that, you said it all beautifully, but I think, you know, an example that we just lived, which was really beautiful, was the land acknowledgement. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's a perfect example of thinking on your toes and kind of like course correcting and recognizing that. So I think that is something that, you know, Burning Man culture, burners can definitely, and it already happens again, but like when it comes to like more of those specific like social justice-y themes, really kind of moving with that and just like, oh yeah, we're definitely going to include it, you know, now we know, you know, so really learning from those things that might be difficult and those difficult conversations is super important. And what I appreciate about mutual aid, especially in my ward, I live in Ward 6 in particular, we're one of the largest wards, and we have, well, actually Ward 5 now has more of the cases, but before it started out, but one of the organizers, you know, came in and basically said, you know, These are our principles. This is how mutual aid should definitely be going. We have to center these folks, and, you know, like, we're going to make mistakes, and that's fine to make mistakes. And it's fine to ask questions. You know, this is why we're all here, is to learn from each other and really start to build towards this new world, because, you know, capitalism is going away. You know, like this, we can't sustain anymore. So just really recognizing that, you know, we are all learners as we are all teachers as well.
Well, I feel like what I just heard kind of both you and Joshua speak to a little bit, which I think is really important, is kind of the dynamicness words between the mutual aid value of longevity of effort, of commitment, of relationship building, versus our kind of immediacy principle and our value of duocracy. Because the truth is that doing something isn't always the thing that's going to most serve the people who are experiencing the brunt of whatever systemic failure you're thinking about in that moment. I do want to give Michael a moment to share if there are any other kind of challenges or alignments that you've noticed between Burning Man culture and mutual aid before we switch gears.
Thanks. I mean, I'm just kind of in awe of Joshua and Ursa Lee. But I mean, I think that there's just like perfect alignment in terms of the, like, burners are kind of ready-made to be doing mutual aid, and then mutual aid kind of smooths out, and like the precepts of mutual aid kind of smooth out a lot of the rough edges, maybe that burners would tend to bring to things, like, you know, like duocracy is essential, you know, participation immediacy is essential, but also it's essential when you go into a context to understand that context, and to build trust, which takes time, which is something that I'm learning personally. But you know, the challenge that I've been facing, most of my friends basically up until 2 months ago were all in the burner world, and you know, why is it that there aren't more burners doing mutual aid when kind of intellectually and philosophically it's so aligned? And I think it may just take time, but it's also kind of, I just want to emphasize that, like, this is the thing. Like, we all kind of, you know, people think of Burning Man as like, you know, a party in the desert or whatever, but like deep down know that it's a lot more. And if there's ever been a time that, you know, the burners on this call, we're kind of hoping, like, yeah, wouldn't it be great to have more of these things in our lives? Like this is it. Like, this is the thing.
And I think what's really important about what you just said that immediately comes up for me is something that I've been thinking about actually since I started working with Burners Without Borders and thinking about the overlap between Burning Man culture and mutual aid frameworks, which is that as burners, we do not need to take up the mantle of mutual aid in order to recognize the overlap and the crossover and the things that our communities may learn from one another. So we are gonna take some time to bring people on to ask their questions. And before we do, we just want to spend a few minutes talking about what we do with this information. It's been a lot, and we're going to be sharing a lot of additional resources at the end of this call, but I'd love to open it up for any of the panelists who want to speak first. But like, what's something that a listener could do right now, or a tool that you can apply in response to coronavirus, like right now?
I guess piggyback off what I was just saying, that like this is the thing. And since you said coronavirus, like I really want to, I want to emphasize that, like, doing. And again, the poll at the beginning said most people are on the Burning Man side of the family, right? So we all know how to do, and I really would just want to emphasize that, like, all of the rules, and I try to say this to like my local group, like all the rules that we thought existed, like, oh, I can't call the CEO of that company and ask for a donation. Oh, I can't talk to people on the street. Those are the rules. The rules are over. Like, this that we are in right now, nobody has experienced this. Everyone is making it up. So like, make it up yourself, and like you are incredibly empowered to actually do things. And I think we're all plagued by this idea of powerlessness in this massive world that we exist in. And part of that is, yes, we're just one in many billions, but also part of that is there's this infrastructure and this structure built to ensure that we, inadvertently feel powerless. And by just doing, you can be powerful and do things.
Yeah, I resonate with all of that. And additionally, we were talking earlier about like emergent strategies and Adrienne Marie Brown. So in honor of that, obviously Octavia Butler was like a big inspiration. I'm wearing a shirt. I don't know if you guys can see it. Mind of My Mind. It's such a good book. Very interesting, but it's a good book. But basically kind of the idea that Octavia Butler wrote, radical self-help, society help, planet help to shape the future we want. That kind of goes in line with just, basically mutual aid, Burning Man, and just kind of just being a good person, like, again, everything Michael said, I resonate completely. And in particular, I think what is really for me in terms of like mutual aid and something that can be done are tangible things. So if you have a tangible skill that that nonprofit might not necessarily have, because again, they're strapped for resources and they're competing for grants across the board with several other folks. So if you're a graphic designer, offer to make a flyer. I had a flyer that someone actually in our ward created. It's over there, whatever. Or, if you are a bookkeeper, offer to look at their books and say, hey, you know what, I have this skill, let me help you out. If you're a lawyer, you know what I mean? So like very tangible skills that often cost organizations a lot of money. If you have the time and the capacity, I would definitely encourage that those type of skills are often, because you do it for your day-to-day job, you don't think about it in terms of like, oh, I can offer that skill. Because again, going back to what I was reflecting on earlier in terms of people wanting Instagrammable moments, and that's not always the case, but people want to be, sometimes folks want to be passing out, a bag, or they want to be on the front lines, and that could be, it might not be the time and place for that. So if you have the ability to offer a tangible skill, I would definitely encourage that as well.
Yeah, I know burners that are sewing masks every day and mailing them out to people. I know burners that are, again, like taking their bus and trying to figure out how to use it to do food distribution, homies in New York. I know burners that are doing community gardens and growing stuff. I know some folks, actually they're not burners, but I wish they were burners, who are distilling alcohol in their kitchen in order to make hand sanitizer, which I think is really awesome. I think those are all examples of things. I would really encourage people to, we're so much better together. So find a pod, figure out how to get some of your peeps that are, in your neighborhood. I think maybe there's a resource about making the pods in your neighborhood, like dropping off flyers that we'll share, or I'll make sure we do. That's available, or just people, your friends in the burner community. If you don't already have, half dozen people that you're talking to all the time, figure out what y'all can do together. I think that's really, really, really valuable. Or just hang out together, like provide, mental health support for people, for all of us. I think we all need that right now. So yeah, I think those are key things. I think food and housing are going to be the things that are really going to be challenging over the next 6 months, next couple of years. So if you're able to help out with that, that's like, I think that's going to be really important for all of us. And we may, you may be glad that you're plugged into that, in a year or two, if you get the opportunity. Yeah. And I think that's what I have.
Can I just add, in addition to food and housing, mental health is going to be huge.
Yep, and we're seeing that in our community too. And if folks would like to find more resources to learn about the kind of impact work that burners are already doing, we're going to relink to our BWB newsletter in the event page. And we're also going to relink to the Wednesday night calls, because we've gotten more than 70 projects through those Wednesday night calls that have grown in really amazing ways. I think Kathleen is on the call, and their project Masks Are Vital has shipped out like 40,000 masks since they started just a few months ago. So those are great examples. Should we take some questions? I'm going to take your silence as a yes. So Tranquility, if you want to help us, I'd love to see if we can bring Gustavo on to ask his question to the panelists live.
Hold on. Hi. Hi, how's everybody doing? I'm not sure which, I asked so many questions. I don't know where to start.
The one that I have saved for you, so I'll tell you, and you can see if you want to give us a one sentence expansion, is how do the concepts of collaboration, coordination, and cooperation connect with the concept of mutual aid?
Well, when I was asking that question, I was thinking about, I also asked another question later on in which I asked about how other disciplines or other systems of thought, because I think every system of thought every concept has a tree of origin of ideas. And I was thinking, how do these ideas connect with other ideas that I already talked about? And collaboration, cooperation, coordination are things that we do to connect and to support each other and to learn from each other. But I was also thinking about the fact that we can also, for example, we can use design thinking as another tool to. So I'm thinking about mutual aid and other ideas as tools that we can use to create something. So mutual aid can be a framework, but how does that connect with other frameworks? Other ideas. So my initial question about collaboration, I think it's important to clarify the difference between those three things, but at the same time, I think that there's other entities, other things like ethnography or learning experience design, other frameworks that combined with this could be really powerful. But I mean, I'm going a little bit too far away in every direction, but my mind is going to, how do we connect other ideas to create this, our system of values and mutual aid, really. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah, well, can I jump in on that? Well, so I think, I don't even remember if we mentioned this, but the way I and kind of my community around mutual aid has been approaching it is that it has to be hyper-local. And mutual aid is a set of values. It's a way of relating to each other within a hyper-local community. And so because of that, it is, by definition political, because it is not electoral politics, it's, local people relating to each other, taking care of each other. And so you can apply ethnography, you can apply other tools and approaches within that, or even like, at the super level, nationwide, statewide, whatever. But in terms of organizing at the hyper-local level, like mutual aid is the way to do it. And I see it as the application of Burning Man principles.
Thank you. That really helps. The whole hyperlocal thing, I think, makes it all come together. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just chime in. I think, I think that you're totally right that there's all these different disciplines and kind of emerging philosophies, ways of understanding things that all overlap and relate in different ways. And I definitely think of it as like, we see so many of these systems, the social systems, the economic systems, the political systems that are failing. They're not working, for so many people. Nick wrote that great piece about the lung disaster the other week that I thought kind of beautifully captures some of this. And I think that these different kinds of frameworks, such as, permaculture and regenerative agriculture, mutual aid, different kinds of spiritual practice and ways of relating with people and all these things are kind of different facets that show us these other systems that are not working, because we see these other alternatives that are kind of working. But I think that, we really need, as you said, need to merge some of these things together, because there's no one one thing that's going to be like the thing that's going to, you know, do everything, right? Like that's part of the old story, is that there's ever like one thing that's going to do everything, right? We need all of it. And so, yeah, and I think that again goes back to the collectivism and working with groups of people, and not thinking that any single person is gonna know all of it or figure out all of it, because they're not. But when we work together, these beautiful things happen.
I just want to shout out that Christopher just dropped a link to the long disaster piece that Joshua just referenced into the chat box, and it is amazing. Ursula, did you want to respond to that one, or? You're good. Okay, well then great. I think we have time for maybe 2 more folks to ask their questions live. Can we bring up Larissa?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, Molly. Nice to see you. I'm also in San Francisco. And maybe to give everyone a little bit background about my question, with our science policy group at UCSF, we started a project, a mutual aid project, Clean Hands, to bring hand sanitizers into prisons and jails. And then we got such a big response that we also started to do it in underserved communities in San Francisco. And we were collaborating with an awesome community organizer, and from the beginning it was clear that he will do a documentary and stuff on it. And I was also like obviously clear that at some point it will be for his fame, basically. And it seemed like our leader or the person who initiated the project was not as aware of that. So at some point she just like cut collaboration, and now everything is stopped, and it's like even going to be a bit crazy, like with a lawyer, whether that movie can come or whether we are like fully out of the movie. And it's a really sad story around a mutual aid project like this. And therefore my question really is to the panel, and also really nice to see Ursula. How do you deal with such people? Would you only like work with existing organizations to avoid things like this? Or if the person really can connect you to the people and the communities you want to serve, do you take it that a person can have like a personal motive to actually benefit personally from that mutual aid project, when in return, based like on a harm reduction approach, more people are helped?
Hey, how are you? That's so crazy. So I think this is sort of going on in my ward as well. We are currently, so basically our ward has broken up into a few different like sub-pods per our neighborhood. And basically down the street from where I live, there is a shelter for femme folks, basically. And you know, it's kind of, there's a lot of secrecy around it because it's ran by, you know, the Catholic Charities. But additionally, there hasn't been word put out because folks don't want the neighbors to be alarmed, because often folks that are experiencing homelessness are already marginalized. So you throw in, you know, the fact that they're being housed in the community center where all the folks go and vote, where kids go play, that might create some sort of fear. So there's just a lot of issues around that. In addition to that, one of the core organizers for kind of bringing resources and materials and just kind of being there for the women, she's getting a lot of flack. You know, and I was texting with her this morning. And what's happening with her in this case, and I'm not sure if I'm speaking to your situation in terms of like, so basically she is basically a wholehearted person who is just doing this out of the goodness of her heart. She's one person. She's already spent thousands of dollars to try to get supplies and all that stuff. This morning, you know, the Catholic Charities threw away all of the stuff because they were like, this isn't, they basically threw it away. And in addition, I helped her secure, you know, hand sanitizer from Dr. Bronner's. And I'm a little worried because I'm like, I hope that they don't throw away that as well, because now it's getting to like a personality thing. And I think that's kind of what I was hearing with your situation. It almost sounds like an ego thing. And that's a big part of mutual aid, is to take the ego out of it. Because again, this is not for you. It's not for, you know, your accolades or to put on your resume. So that's really hard to hear. And in the situation that we're currently going through, you know, she, you know, basically the girl had a mental breakdown I had to talk her down, but, she sent out emails to all of these organizers and was like, hey, I need your support because, the Catholic Charities keep harassing the women. They made a woman who was pregnant leave, the shelter, so there's a lot of those layers and that history going on as well. And, I'm trying my best to support her in that way. Again, I'm not a professional psychologist. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have any of that skill, but I'm definitely, what I'm offering is a lot of support in listening to her when she's talking about these issues, because oftentimes that can help you kind of come to the conclusion. In your situation, that's hard. I mean, man, the ego is such a bitch when it comes to organizing and like trying to navigate that, especially in a time where folks are already at edge. There's already tension in the air. It's like, how do you address that? You know what I mean? I don't know if anyone else has something to provide, but what I could say, a tactic that I'm doing is just trying to be a supportive ear for the girl who's mainly organizing.
Yeah, I would, thank you for sharing that story, Larissa and Ursa Lee. I kind of call in a little bit, like, again, my like burner training, and like particularly like inclusion, which is that like we welcome the stranger, and that, like what we're trying to do is not like outcomes oriented. We're not trying to reach a target of X number of money raised or, Y number of people fed, right? We're trying to build a community, and the people in the community are the people in the community. Like, we're not in a place where excommunicating people yet. Maybe we will, right? So, so I think like in terms of, I think we have an opportunity, people who are kind of starting this movement, and this is a movement. This is like mutual aid is a movement that will grow, right? We have an opportunity to like set the culture of the movement, and like we don't want people who are trying to make a quick buck running this movement, because that's not the right culture. But as burners, we believe that if we kind of demonstrate a certain set of values to the stranger who comes in, regardless of their intentions, they'll kind of come around and they'll get it.
We are getting to time, and I'm about to just close us officially so that no one feels like they have to stay. But that question of how to navigate the balance of ego and impact in your impact work, one thing that really helps and resonates with me when I'm figuring out how to be in relationship with collaborators is the idea that the process is the outcome, right? If we're not doing it in a process that's in alignment with our values, then no matter how quantitatively valuable the outcome is, it's still going to be harmful for some people, maybe even ourselves. So with that, I just want to end the official call so that no one feels like they can't leave or attend to other things, because we are at the top of the hour. Our panelists are able to stay on the call for 10 or 15 minutes, right? Yes. If there are any additional questions, there are so many nuances, and we've barely brushed the surface in this hour together. If you've been inspired or interested or challenged by this conversation, we hope that it's a jumping off point, and to support your ongoing learning about the history, framework, and ongoing organizing of mutual aid, we've put together a webpage where you can find learning materials from experts and established mutual aid groups working within this framework. So you can visit, we'll drop it into the chat, but it is burnerswithoutborders.org/projects/mutual aid. And if you'd like to continue this conversation in the immediate future, I'm gonna share my screen, right? It's ugly. We have 3 ways for you to continue this conversation right now, and we'll drop this slide as well so that you have it. But next week next weekend, we have our BWB Spring Summit, which is now digital, which is awesome because it means that we can welcome in a lot more people. It's a no-cost event. And it's going to be throughout the morning and afternoon on May 23rd. And you can find out all about it on our website. There will be a track that is about mutual aid. We also have our Facebook group, BWB Volunteers Worldwide, which is a community-driven platform. So you can go there to post questions and continue to have community-driven conversation. We also have a BWB Worldwide Slack space. This space is organic and we're still architecting it, but we get some really, really insightful conversations and projects in there. So if you are a Slack person anyway, that might be for you. And as a bonus, if you are not already subscribed to our quarterly Burners Without Borders newsletter, it is the best way to find out what's been happening in the previous quarter. And we just sent one out 2 days ago to update about all of the burner projects that are happening around COVID-19. So I'm gonna stop sharing and stop presenting. And with that, we just wanna give another huge thank you to our panelists. It was a real pleasure to participate in and organize this conversation with y'all, and also to everyone on our tech support team for this panel.
And to Molly Rose, who put in incredible amount of planning and work for this.
And it looks like there's a lot of love in the chat box for y'all too. So at this point, we are officially finished, but we can go ahead and continue answering questions. I also want to invite anyone who's staying on the call, you can go ahead and turn your video on if you want to see who all's in the room. And you can unmute yourselves if you have a question that you want to ask our panelists directly. Bye. Great.
I think there was a question though that was like in the chat. It was like, what can I do? What's something I can do right now? I think I had dropped basically, get on Facebook and join your mutual aid group, and basically just sit back for about a week and just watch. I know Michael brought that up a little bit earlier. It might have been in a different conversation we might have had, but basically just getting yourself out there and getting exposure. And then you can start to pick up on like kind of the conversation that is happening already, and just kind of be a fly on the wall and see kind of like what the culture is already for that mutual aid group. Because again, his mutual aid group is very different than mine. That's very different from, you know, I saw somebody, Tugboat, you know, he's in Ward 2, very different than his mutual aid group. So I think that that is something that is very easy that you can just do right away. Just sign up on Facebook and just start to kind of watch Kitty. Wow.
Or start
Ursula,
one. Yeah, sorry. If one doesn't exist, like definitely feel free to start one. And there's a huge community of people who I would love to help you do that. And don't let it wait.
Go.
Perfectionism. I just want to say, like, drop the perfectionism, everyone, because like it's held me back and it's held all of you back. I guarantee it. And just like, don't wait for it to be perfect. Just do it.
And for people who aren't on Facebook, I saw someone in the chat asking about how do I get involved if I'm not on Facebook? What Michael just said is twofold. There are so many Google Docs that list the regional groups and that list the Slack workspaces. And I believe at least one comprehensive link tree is on our Burners Without Borders webpage of additional resources for folks to check out. Yeah, Baroque.
Hey, how are you? So it's 2 a.m. here in Israel, and I'm very excited to be joining this conversation. Thank you so much for bringing the topic on. I'm going to be, I just want to, comment that when I look at the values or the principles of Burning Man and those of mutual aid, and I think I've been involved in both arenas, and I think the main takeaway that I can take from Burning Man is the fact that in Burning Man, everything is like a party. Like you don't do kitchen shift, you do you know, you do party in the kitchen, you don't do cleaning shift, you do party cleaning up, you know, everything is like a party. So I would really love to hear reflections about how can you dance your way into mutual aiding, or maybe I would translate that into questions of how to invite or how to conceptualize mutual aid as something which is fun and party-like. So if anyone wants to comment on that, it would be interesting for me to hear.
I definitely have thoughts. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna. I'm so glad you brought this up because I think this is such an essential part of Burning Man culture. And like we're really good at doing all the serious stuff too, but like this is something very unique that we can bring. And I think Molly said it, or oh no, it's Joshua, that like bringing like some joy and playfulness, that like, yes, we are doing serious and important work, but like we don't need to be so freaking serious all the time. And I can't tell you how many like insanely serious people I've come across. And like I'm in Queens, New York, and I have a fire escape, and I started playing jazz I don't play it myself, but I play it as a speaker for the community, and I set up a little microphone and an amp, and I just kind of talk to people once in a while. I spy with some kids, and like reminding people, first of all, I'm on the 6th floor, so reminding them to like look up, and second of all, reminding them that like you can interact with people in your community. And I think that the fact that we're in this very unique time is forcing the people to reevaluate their like interpersonal priorities, and it's a great way to like slide in this idea of like kind of changing the way we relate to each other. And I think joy and play, I think you're absolutely right, and I think burners should absolutely start thinking about that.
If I can add to that, and I think it's on the same note, and as someone who is not familiar with burner culture really, but what my but one of like my perceptions around it is around that like joy and celebration, and it's around like also a celebration and doing that in community and being able to bring your whole self into where you are is kind of how like my perception of what that is. And sometimes I think my perception is about how maybe sometimes that can feel like maybe very white in some cases, and once again, this is perception, it's not based on actually attending events, but I think what that means, right? It's the freedom in being able to come as you are and not be doing all the code switching, not thinking about having to hide this piece of you and the other. And I think that is a freedom that it allows for it, and maybe why some participate in different ways. But in thinking about mutual aid work, what I think is the opportunity here, right, and how we connect to folks is about bringing those pieces of joy and getting to know people in their full selves and understanding like where they're coming from. And I think in the point that was made previous, I'm sorry because I didn't catch your name, I think it was Ursa, about if you're trying to do mutual aid work, in observing first and asking is because you want to make sure that when you come in, you're being respectful of those like community members, and that you're like getting to know, and that also that you're asking how you can help and not assuming, right, in which is the way that you do it. And when you do that, remember, it's about human connection. And I think many of you have mentioned that it's not about like reaching a target number and such, but like connecting to other people and what that means. And so how do you do that in such a way that like you can also bring celebration and take joy in some of those moments, because it can be really hard in thinking about all the need that there is. But I think it's also having some solace in that as individuals. There's so much we can do, you know, like, and Michael knows, and Michael has been like, the reason I'm on this college because I knew he was doing this, and has like been such a big support in doing that. And like, in so many ways, like a cheerleader with a text message or an email, or like connecting me to a resource as I try to provide mutual aid to folks in Corona, right? Like I had my kid like draw something on some grocery bags that I was delivering, just because like, you know, it was just like that. Like, how do I add a personal touch, but you know, without making a big thing, and just was like, hope this helps, and just like a drawing, right? Like, and someone texted back and was like so thankful for it. So just those little moments of like, how do we do that? Just being able to talk to people as human decent beings, as opposed to like just someone in need, right? Like this isn't about charity work. It's literally like, how can I connect to like this other human and enjoying that connection, and really focus on connection and joy and pleasure, right? Like I'm thinking a lot about pleasure activism? What does it mean to organize for the things that we want as opposed to in opposition to what we don't?
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Erica. Yeah, I think, you know, for me in navigating this question, and I think it's such a great question because it is such an essential thing that the Burning Man community can bring to work. And I think just recognizing also that like pleasure and creativity and these core things can definitely look different in different communities. And also that for many people, and maybe it's even like a core psychological human thing, there needs to be a level of, you know, a sense of safety before someone wants to express in that way. And so if that's not like the container that's being held, then that might feel really bad to the person or like not be a thing that's available. And I know this is something that like I've gotten feedback before about like the Burner principle of like radical self-expression and how that can play out in particularly like kind of public, you know, non-burner spaces where, you know, someone that experiences oppression from police, for example, might feel like to stand out in that way is really dangerous for them. Like, you know, it's physically dangerous. And so just being mindful of that and kind of being observant. And I think there's a way that burners, I've seen, and I've even done this myself, can come in and almost be colonizing in the imposition of like, this needs to be, you know, a party. And I'm just speaking, I guess, from my experience in the United States. So Brooke, I'm not sure how that's relevant in Israel or if that resonates, but so I think just, you know, being really mindful of those dynamics and then figuring out how to do that, I think is a beautiful thing that we can do.
Maybe linked to that, a question: has anyone experienced with like really playful ways to interact with communities, especially when they come and bring you in? Because what also happened with that project is that one of the communities, they asked us to get more involved in whatever science education things. But I don't want to be like top down as a scientist. So I want it to be community based from them and playful and creative. But who is best to actually bring in like the direction that it actually takes?
In terms of playfulness, before I worked with Burning Man, my job was as the director of Clowns Without Borders, which is an international organization that organizes free performance and workshop tours in refugee camps, natural disaster sites, and communities in crisis around the world. There are 15 chapters, and we only go where we're invited, and we always work in partnership with either an individual or an organization who's local and trusted and living in that community, which is the person who identifies the venues and gives feedback about what kind of show the show should be. So that just came to mind, obviously, because that's my background. And I think that what I like about it is that Clowns Without Borders USA specifically, to me, has been a really powerful example of a way that a nonprofit can operate from a very clear anti-colonial framework, and naming that as people from the US, especially working in collaboration with people from outside of the United States, has been really powerful in the way that the relationships between the partner organizations have been able to develop. So that might be something interesting for you. They have a lot of great blog posts about all different kinds of power dynamic related stuff.
And just quickly too, I would just honestly keep it light too. Like things don't have to be so serious as everyone has said. For our mutual aid group, there's supposed to be wind down Thursday next week, you know, just so everyone can get on Zoom and drink wine together. It could be something as simple as that in terms of like the organizers, in terms of like folks that are directly benefiting from, you know, whatever mutual aid is occurring in the community. I think just the basic thing of, you know, talking with folks with compassion and talking with them, not in a sense of like charity case. So like, I really liked the other week I was at the church, because we're based out of a church. It's not religious, which is, you know, if you're not of a religion and you're getting services from a church, it might have that dynamic. But we don't have that. But anyways, one of the ladies, you know, she has been in the neighborhood for at least, you know, her entire life. And just the way that she was speaking with folks, it was really like, hey, you're like my aunt, basically, or like, you could be my sister. So I think really taking that approach in terms of, you know, folks that are directly in relation to the mutual aid for organizing, you know, just again, keep it really light, talk with folks, like make jokes and stuff. You know, we are allowed to laugh in COVID times. You know, we need to laugh, like we need to have funny moments and just like, again, joy, pleasure, all that stuff. So.
Y'all, I love this conversation, and we are past our 15 minutes that y'all said that you could stay for. So we are going to close out this call. In respect to everybody's time, thank you all so much for staying late. We'll leave the call open for a few minutes so that you can grab anything you want out of the chat, but we will be dropping the recording into the Facebook event along with a brief survey, probably on Monday.
Contact information?
For y'all?
Yeah,
for sure. All of their contact information is in their panelist bios, but definitely drop that in there and we'll relink them to the panelist bios when we do the follow-up emails.
Yeah, anyone who wants to talk, I can do this all day.
Can someone also share the chat? Is that possible?
I think that it is possible to get a transcript of the chat, so we'll probably be able to share that when we share out the video as well. And I think it's also possible to put subtitles on a Zoom call, so if that's possible, we'll also do that.
You can also grab the chat yourself if you're on a computer and you go in the lower right corner and click on the 3 dots more.
Janine looks like they're driving.
Chat.
I just saved it. I can send it out. Well, I don't think I have Janine's email, so never mind. Cool.
Can we recommend a podcast around the subject? One really good podcast is called The Response, for that person if they're still here. And we'll definitely share that. I'll add that to the webpage with all of the Mutual Aid 101 links. As we were talking, even though there's like 15 links on that webpage, you guys reminded me of like 15 more that I was like, oh, we should put that on there too.
Molly, wasn't there someone on a recent BWB call who does a podcast?
Yeah, was it Eamon?
I don't remember.
Or was it?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Erica. I know you're leaving, but I really appreciated you being here.
Certainly in terms of the cultural and community building work, the one podcast that I would really recommend is How to Survive the End of the World by Adrienne Marie Brown and Autumn Brown. It's so dope, and they talk about such good stuff and have like really great people on that are, you know, have been doing all these things in community for a very long time.
All right, thank you, Joshua, Ursa Lee, Michael, and all of our folks who stayed on till the bitter end. Thank you guys so much.